Picture this. You're Prince Harry, sixth in line to the British throne, approaching your father's residence for what should be an intimate conversation. Instead of the warm welcome you might expect, you're stopped cold by security guards who look at you not as a son, but as a suspect. The wand-like device in their hands isn't checking for weapons. It's scanning for something far more dangerous in the royal world: recording equipment. This isn't a scene from a thriller movie. This actually happened. In the corridors of royal power, where family secrets are worth more than crown jewels, where a single recorded conversation could topple centuries of carefully crafted public image, even a prince can become the enemy. What drives a father to have his own son searched like a common criminal? What secrets were so explosive that the king's security team treated Prince Harry as a potential spy in his own family home? And what does this unprecedented breach of royal protocol reveal about the deep fractures running through the most famous family in the world? The answer lies in a story of betrayal, desperation, and the deadly game of royal survival, where trust is a luxury the monarchy can no longer afford, and where even blood relations are seen as threats to the throne. Welcome to the shocking true story that the palace never wanted you to hear, the day Prince Harry was treated like an enemy of the crown by his own father's guards. The morning of March 15, 2023, started like any other day in the life of Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. The California sun streamed through the windows of his Montecito mansion as he prepared for what would become one of the most humiliating encounters of his royal life. What he didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary Tuesday would mark a new low in his relationship with his father, King Charles III, and reveal just how far the royal family was willing to go to protect themselves from their own blood. Harry had been planning this visit for weeks. The conversation with his father was long overdue, and the weight of unspoken words had been growing heavier with each passing day since the release of his explosive memoir, Spare. The book had sent shockwaves through the palace walls, revealing intimate family secrets and painting a picture of a dysfunctional royal household that the monarchy had spent decades trying to hide. Now, 3 months after its publication, the fallout was still echoing through every corridor of royal power. The Duke of Sussex had flown into London the previous evening, staying at a private residence rather than any royal property. The days when he could simply walk into Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle as if they were home were long gone. His security detail, now privately funded rather than provided by the Metropolitan Police, had spent hours coordinating with royal protection officers to ensure his visit would go smoothly. Or so they thought. As Harry's convoy approached Clarence House, the King's official London residence, the atmosphere was tense. Royal protection officers lined the street, their faces stern and professional, but there was something different in the air. The usual protocol seemed heightened, more aggressive than Harry remembered from his years as a working royal. What he was about to discover was that his father's security team had received very specific instructions about his visit, instructions that would transform a son's visit to his father into something resembling a high-security interrogation. The first sign that something was wrong came when Harry's car was stopped not at the usual entrance, but at a side gate typically used for deliveries and service personnel. A senior protection officer approached the vehicle, his face impassive as he gestured for Harry to step out. The Duke, confused but compliant, emerged from the car expecting the usual brief security check that all visitors to royal residences undergo. Instead, he was escorted not into the main building, but into a small security lodge adjacent to the main entrance. The room was sparse, containing little more than a desk, 2 chairs, and several electronic devices that Harry didn't immediately recognize. 2 more security officers were waiting inside, their demeanor professional but unmistakably hostile. "Your Royal Highness," one of the officers began, his voice carefully neutral, "we need to conduct a security screening before you can proceed to meet His Majesty." Harry's confusion deepened. In all his years as a working royal, he had never been subjected to anything more than a cursory security check, and certainly nothing that required being taken to a separate room. "I'm sorry, what kind of screening?" he asked, his voice betraying his growing unease. The officer's response would later be burned into Harry's memory. "We need to check for any recording devices, surveillance equipment, or other electronic devices that might compromise the security of this meeting." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. Recording devices. His own father's security team was treating him like a potential spy, someone who might secretly record their conversation and leak it to the media. The implications were staggering and deeply personal. This wasn't just about security protocols. This was about trust, or rather, the complete absence of it. "You're searching me for recording equipment?" Harry asked, his voice rising with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I'm here to speak with my father, not to conduct some sort of espionage operation." The officers remained unmoved. "These are our instructions, sir. We need to ensure that no recording devices are present during your meeting with His Majesty."
Harry's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening.
The security sweep wasn't random or routine, it was specifically designed to detect recording equipment. This meant that someone, likely his father or his advisors, had made a deliberate decision that Harry posed a threat significant enough to warrant this unprecedented security measure. The search itself was thorough and humiliating. Electronic wands swept over his body, detecting any metal or electronic components. His phone was confiscated and thoroughly examined, with security experts checking for any recording applications or suspicious software. His clothing was searched for hidden microphones or recording devices. Every pocket, every seam, every possible hiding place was scrutinized with military precision. Throughout the ordeal, Harry maintained his composure, but inside, he was reeling. The message was clear. He was no longer trusted as a member of the royal family. In the eyes of the palace security apparatus, he had become an outsider, a potential threat who needed to be neutralized before he could gain access to sensitive royal conversations. The officer conducting the search was methodical and professional, but there was something almost ritualistic about the process, as if it had been practiced specifically for this moment. The wand moved over Harry's body in precise patterns, checking for any electronic signatures that might indicate the presence of recording equipment. When it passed over his watch, there was a brief pause as the officer examined the device more closely, checking to ensure it wasn't capable of recording audio or video. "Is this really necessary?" Harry asked at one point, his frustration becoming increasingly difficult to contain. "I'm afraid so, sir," the officer replied without looking up from his work. "These are direct orders from the highest levels of palace security." The phrase highest levels wasn't lost on Harry. This wasn't a decision made by mid-level security personnel. This came from the very top of the royal hierarchy. Either his father had personally ordered this humiliating search, or his most senior advisors had convinced him that his own son posed such a significant security risk that extreme measures were necessary. As the search continued, Harry's thoughts turned to how dramatically his relationship with his family had deteriorated. There had been a time when he could walk freely through any royal residence, when palace staff greeted him with warmth and familiarity. Now, he was being treated like a hostile foreign agent attempting to infiltrate the heart of the monarchy. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had served his country in Afghanistan, who had dedicated years of his life to royal duties, being searched for recording equipment by the very people whose job it was to protect him. The trust that should exist between a father and son had been so completely eroded that even a private family meeting required security measures typically reserved for high-risk diplomatic encounters. When the search finally concluded, the lead officer nodded to his colleagues. "He's clear," he announced, as if Harry were a piece of luggage that had successfully passed through airport security. Harry was handed back his phone and personal effects, but the damage had been done. The message had been delivered with brutal clarity. He was no longer welcome in the royal fold, no longer trusted with family secrets, no longer considered safe enough to have an unmonitored conversation with his own father. As he prepared to finally enter Clarence House, Harry realized that this wasn't just about security protocols or palace paranoia. This was about power, control, and the lengths to which the monarchy would go to protect itself from perceived threats, even when those threats came from within the family itself. The Duke of Sussex had always known that his relationship with his family was complicated, but he had never imagined it would come to this. As he walked toward the meeting that had taken weeks to arrange, he carried with him not just the weight of unresolved conflicts, but the fresh humiliation of being treated like an enemy by his own bloodline. The search had taken 25 minutes, but its impact would last far longer. It represented a point of no return in the deteriorating relationship between Harry and the institution he had once served faithfully. More than that, it revealed the paranoia and fear that now dominated royal thinking, where even family members were seen as potential threats to be neutralized rather than loved ones to be trusted. After enduring the humiliating security search, Prince Harry was finally escorted into Clarence House, but the damage to his psyche was already profound. The grand corridors that had once felt like extensions of home now seemed cold and unwelcoming, lined with staff members who avoided making direct eye contact. The very air seemed thick with tension and unspoken accusations. As Harry walked through the familiar halls, his mind kept returning to the search he had just endured. The methodical way the security officers had swept every inch of his body for recording devices wasn't just protocol. It was a deliberate humiliation designed to remind him of his new status as an outsider. The palace had effectively declared that Prince Harry, A man who had once been sixth in line to the throne was now considered such a significant threat that he couldn't be trusted to have a private conversation with his own father. The escort led Harry to a small anteroom adjacent to the king's private study, where he was told to wait. This, too, was unusual. In the past, family meetings had been informal affairs, with Harry simply walking into his father's presence without ceremony. Now, he was being treated like a foreign dignitary, requiring formal protocols and carefully managed access. As he sat in the anteroom, Harry couldn't help but notice the subtle but significant changes in how palace staff interacted with him. The warmth that had once characterized these interactions had been replaced by cold professionalism. Staff members who had known him since childhood now addressed him with formal courtesy rather than the familiar affection he had once taken for granted. The waiting gave Harry time to reflect on how completely his world had changed since stepping back from royal duties and, more recently, since the publication of his memoir. Spare had been his attempt to tell his truth, to explain his perspective on a childhood and young adulthood lived under the intense scrutiny of royal life. But the palace had clearly viewed it as something far more sinister, an act of betrayal that required defensive measures. The book had contained revelations that had sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. Harry had written about private family conversations, intimate moments of grief following his mother's death, and behind-the-scenes conflicts that the palace had worked for decades to keep hidden. From the royal family's perspective, Harry had violated the most sacred rule of monarchy, the duty to keep family secrets within family walls. But what Harry hadn't anticipated was how completely this perceived betrayal would transform his relationship with the institution he had once served. The search for recording devices wasn't just about preventing future leaks. It was a symbolic declaration that Harry had forfeited his right to be trusted as a family member. When the door to the anteroom finally opened, it wasn't King Charles who appeared, but his private secretary, a man Harry had known for years but who now regarded him with barely concealed hostility.
"His Majesty will see you now," the secretary announced, his voice devoid of any warmth or familiarity.
Harry was led into his father's private study, a room where he had spent countless hours during his youth, discussing everything from his military service to his charitable work. But as he entered, he immediately noticed that the usual intimate atmosphere had been replaced by something far more formal and guarded. King Charles stood behind his desk rather than greeting his son with the customary embrace. His posture was rigid, his expression carefully controlled, and his eyes betrayed none of the paternal affection that Harry had hoped to see. Instead, there was something else in his father's gaze, a mixture of disappointment, anger, and what looked suspiciously like fear. "Harry," the king said simply, his voice neutral and distant. "Father," Harry replied, uncertain whether to approach for a greeting or remain at a respectful distance. The king gestured to a chair positioned directly across from his desk, creating a physical barrier between father and son that seemed to symbolize the emotional distance that had grown between them. As Harry took his seat, he couldn't help but notice that the chair had been positioned in a way that made him feel like he was attending a disciplinary hearing rather than a family reunion. "I trust the security screening wasn't too inconvenient," King Charles said, his words carefully chosen and delivered with practiced diplomatic neutrality. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harry realized that his father was not only aware of the humiliating search, but had likely ordered it himself. The casual way the king mentioned it suggested that he saw nothing inappropriate about having his own son searched for recording devices. "It was thorough," Harry replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I have to say, I never expected to be treated like a security threat in my own family." King Charles's expression didn't change, but there was a slight shift in his posture that suggested Harry's words had struck home. "These are unprecedented times, Harry. Your recent publications have created extraordinary security concerns that require extraordinary measures." The word publications was delivered with particular emphasis, making it clear that the king viewed Harry's memoir not as a son's attempt to share his truth, but as a hostile act against the monarchy itself. The plural form suggested that Charles was also concerned about future revelations, interviews, or books that might emerge from his son. "You mean my book?" Harry said, deciding to address the elephant in the room directly. "You're treating me like an enemy because I wrote about my own experiences." "You wrote about private family conversations," King Charles replied, his voice becoming slightly sharper. "You shared intimate details of family grief, personal conflicts, and sensitive information that was never meant for public consumption. You violated the fundamental trust that holds our family together." The accusation stung because Harry knew there was truth to it. He had indeed shared private conversations and intimate family moments in his memoir, But from his perspective, he had been trying to explain his truth and provide context for his decisions. He hadn't realized that the palace would view his honesty as a form of warfare. "I shared my truth," Harry said, his voice rising slightly. "I explained why I felt I had no choice but to step back from royal duties. I thought people deserved to understand my perspective." "Your perspective," King Charles repeated, the words dripping with barely contained frustration. "Your perspective required you to share conversations between family members, private moments of grief, and sensitive information about how this family operates. You turned our private pain into public entertainment." The accusation was harsh, but not entirely unfair. Harry's memoir had indeed turned intimate family moments into best-selling content, and while he had believed he was providing necessary context, the palace had clearly viewed it as a profound betrayal of family trust. "I never intended to hurt anyone," Harry said, but even as the words left his mouth, he realized how inadequate they sounded. "Intent is irrelevant," King Charles replied coldly. "The damage is done. The trust is broken. And that's why we find ourselves in this situation today." The conversation was taking on the feel of a diplomatic negotiation rather than a father-son reconciliation. Both men were choosing their words carefully, aware that anything said in this room could potentially become public knowledge at some point in the future. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that the very concern about recording devices that had led to Harry's humiliating search was now governing how they spoke to each other. "So what happens now?" Harry asked, genuinely uncertain about where their relationship could go from this point. King Charles was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering his response carefully. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "That depends entirely on whether we can find a way to rebuild the trust that has been lost." The phrase "rebuild trust" suggested that Charles believed the relationship could be salvaged, but the formal way he delivered it made it clear that any reconciliation would come with conditions and constraints that hadn't existed before Harry's public revelations. "What would that look like?" Harry asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "It would require a fundamental change in how you approach your relationship with this family and this institution," King Charles replied. "It would require understanding that some things must remain private, that some conversations must stay within family walls, and that the monarchy's survival sometimes requires personal sacrifice." Harry felt a chill as he realized what his father was really asking. Rebuilding trust wouldn't just mean keeping future conversations private. It would mean accepting the palace's version of events, remaining silent about his own experiences, and essentially surrendering his right to tell his own story. The meeting had only just begun, but already it was clear that the gulf between father and son had grown wider than either of them had imagined. The search for recording devices had been just the beginning of what would prove to be the most difficult conversation of Harry's life. The tension in King Charles's private study was suffocating, as father and son faced each other across an emotional chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing moment. The formal atmosphere of their meeting, combined with the fresh memory of the humiliating security search, had transformed what should have been a family reunion into something resembling a high-stakes diplomatic negotiation. Prince Harry studied his father's face, searching for any trace of the man who had once comforted him after his mother's death, who had supported his military career, and who had celebrated his charitable achievements. Instead, he saw only the carefully controlled expression of a monarch protecting his institution, even from his own son. "You speak of trust," Harry said, his voice carefully modulated but carrying an undercurrent of pain. "But having me searched for recording devices before I can speak with my own father doesn't exactly demonstrate trust from your side either."
King Charles's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly.
"That search was necessary because your recent actions have demonstrated that private family conversations are no longer safe from public scrutiny when you're involved." The accusation hung heavy in the air.
Harry felt the weight of it, understanding that his father wasn't just talking about the memoir anymore.
The palace's paranoia had grown to encompass any future interactions with Harry, viewing him as a permanent security risk rather than a family member who had made a mistake. "So this is how it's going to be?" Harry asked, gesturing vaguely toward the door through which he had entered after his humiliating screening. "Every time I want to speak with my family, I'll need to be searched like a criminal? That depends on whether you can demonstrate that you understand the gravity of your actions and show a commitment to preventing similar breaches in the future," King Charles replied, his words sounding more like a legal brief than a father's response to his son's question. Harry leaned back in his chair, the reality of his situation becoming increasingly clear. The relationship he had once shared with his father was gone, replaced by this formal, guarded interaction governed by concerns about institutional security rather than family bonds. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. When you ordered that search, when you decided I needed to be checked for recording equipment, did you think about what that would do to me as your son? Did you consider how it would feel to be treated like a threat by my own family? For the first time since Harry had entered the room, King Charles's composed facade seemed to crack slightly. A flicker of something that might have been regret crossed his features, but it was quickly suppressed. I think about the impact of every decision I make, the king replied carefully. But my primary responsibility is to protect this institution and this family from further harm. Your book caused tremendous damage, Harry. It exposed private conversations, intimate family moments, and sensitive information that our enemies could use against us. Our enemies? Harry repeated, his voice rising with incredulity. I'm not your enemy, father. I'm your son who was struggling and trying to explain why he felt he had no choice but to leave. You may not see yourself as an enemy, King Charles said, his voice becoming harder, but your actions have had the same effect as if you were. You've given ammunition to every Republican organization, every tabloid newspaper, and every critic of the monarchy. You've made their job infinitely easier by providing insider information that they could never have obtained otherwise. Harry felt the full weight of his father's accusation. From the palace's perspective, his memoir hadn't been a son's attempt to explain his truth. It had been an act of treason against the institution that had shaped his entire life. I never intended to harm the monarchy, Harry said. But even as he spoke, he realized how naive that sounded, given the explosive nature of his revelations. Intent is irrelevant when the outcome is devastating, King Charles replied coldly. The damage is done, and it's irreversible. The question now is whether you're willing to take steps to prevent further damage. Harry felt trapped. His father was essentially demanding that he surrender his right to speak publicly about his own experiences in exchange for the possibility of rebuilding their relationship. It was a devil's bargain that would require him to accept the palace's version of events and remain silent about his own truth. What exactly are you asking me to do? Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. King Charles reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a document that looked suspiciously like a legal contract. This is a non-disclosure agreement, he said, sliding the papers across the desk toward his son. It would legally prevent you from sharing any information about royal family matters, past or present, without explicit written consent from the palace. Harry stared at the document in disbelief. His own father was asking him to sign a legal agreement that would effectively silence him forever. The implications were staggering. Not only would he be prevented from writing future books or giving interviews about his royal experiences, but the agreement might even restrict his ability to defend himself if the palace chose to attack his character or his actions. You want me to sign a non-disclosure agreement? Harry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You're asking me to legally surrender my right to speak about my own life? I'm asking you to demonstrate that you understand the seriousness of the situation and that you're committed to protecting this family from further harm. King Charles replied, his tone suggesting that he saw the NDA as a reasonable request rather than an unprecedented demand. Harry picked up the document and began reading through its dense legal language. The scope was breathtaking. It would prevent him from discussing not just future family interactions, but also past events that he had already written about in his memoir. It would effectively erase his right to his own narrative, transferring control of his story to the palace communications team. This would prevent me from ever defending myself if the palace chose to attack my character or misrepresent my actions, Harry said, looking up from the document. It would prevent you from continuing to attack this family and this institution, King Charles corrected. It would ensure that private family matters remain private. But it wouldn't prevent the palace from briefing against me anonymously through friendly journalists, would it? Harry asked, his understanding of royal media manipulation serving him well. This is a one-way agreement that silences me while allowing the institution to continue managing the narrative however it sees fit. King Charles didn't deny the accusation, which Harry took as confirmation of his suspicions. The NDA was designed to protect the monarchy from future revelations, while preserving their ability to shape public perception through their extensive media network. The choice is yours, Harry, the king said, his voice carrying the weight of an ultimatum. You can sign this agreement and begin the process of rebuilding trust with your family, or you can continue down the path you've chosen and face the consequences of that decision. Harry understood the subtext clearly. Sign the NDA or be permanently exiled from the royal family. His father was giving him an ultimatum that would force him to choose between his right to tell his own story
and any hope of reconciling with his family.
The silence stretched between them as Harry contemplated his options. Signing the agreement would mean surrendering his voice, accepting the palace's version of events, and potentially enabling future attacks on his character that he would be legally prevented from refuting. Refusing to sign would mean accepting permanent estrangement from his family and the continuation of the hostile relationship that had led to this moment. "I need time to consider this," Harry said finally, setting the document back on the desk. "Of course," King Charles replied, though his tone suggested that he viewed any delay as further evidence of Harry's lack of commitment to reconciliation. "But understand that this offer won't remain on the table indefinitely. At some point, continued defiance will make reconciliation impossible." Harry felt the walls closing in around him. The security search had been humiliating, but this was something far worse, an attempt to legally silence him and control his narrative forever. His father wasn't offering reconciliation. He was offering conditional surrender, disguised as family healing. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Harry realized that he had fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of this encounter. He had come hoping for a genuine conversation about healing their relationship, but his father had been conducting a negotiation designed to neutralize a perceived threat to the monarchy. The prince who had once been sixth in line to the throne was now being treated as an enemy combatant who needed to be managed, controlled, and potentially neutralized through legal agreements and security protocols. The weight of the non-disclosure agreement seemed to press down on Prince Harry as he sat in his father's study, the legal document representing everything that had gone wrong between them. The man across from him was no longer just his father. King Charles had become the embodiment of an institution that viewed Harry as a threat to be neutralized, rather than a son to be reconciled with. "I have one question," Harry said, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning inside him. "If I sign this agreement, if I surrender my right to speak about my own experiences, what guarantee do I have that the palace won't continue to brief against me through anonymous sources?" King Charles's silence spoke volumes. Both men understood that the royal family's relationship with the media was built on a complex web of strategic leaks, anonymous briefings, and carefully managed narratives. The palace had spent decades perfecting the art of media manipulation, and they weren't about to surrender that advantage even if Harry agreed to silence himself. "The palace doesn't engage in media manipulation," King Charles said finally, delivering the lie with the practiced ease of a career politician. Harry almost laughed at the absurdity of the statement. He had grown up watching palace press secretaries carefully orchestrate media coverage, planting favorable stories while undermining negative narratives through strategic background briefings. The idea that his father would claim ignorance of these tactics was both insulting and revealing. "Father," Harry said, using the personal title deliberately, "I've lived in this world my entire life. I know exactly how the palace manages media coverage. I've seen how stories are planted, how narratives are shaped, and how anonymous sources are used to destroy people who become inconvenient." "You're being paranoid," King Charles replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "Am I?" Harry asked, pulling out his phone and navigating to a news article that had appeared just that morning. This story about my erratic behavior and mental health struggles appeared in 3 different newspapers today, all citing palace sources close to the royal family. "Are you telling me you have no idea how that happened?" King Charles glanced at the phone screen but didn't respond directly to Harry's accusation. The silence was damning, confirming what Harry already knew. The palace media machine was already working to undermine his credibility and paint him as unstable and unreliable. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Harry continued, his voice rising with frustration. "You want me to sign an agreement that prevents me from defending myself while your communications team continues to attack my character through friendly journalists. It's not reconciliation you're offering, it's surrender. You brought this on yourself with your reckless revelations," King Charles shot back, his carefully controlled demeanor finally cracking. "You violated the trust of this family, and now you're surprised that there are consequences for your actions." The raw emotion in his father's voice was the first genuine moment they had shared since Harry's arrival. Beneath the formal protocols and legal maneuvering, there was real pain and anger from a father who felt betrayed by his son's public revelations. "I told my truth," Harry replied, matching his father's emotional intensity. "I explained why I felt I had no choice but to step back from royal duties. I thought people deserved to understand what really happened instead of the sanitized version the palace was feeding them. Your truth destroyed family relationships and damaged the institution," King Charles said, his voice heavy with accusation. Your truth gave ammunition to every enemy of the monarchy and made our family look dysfunctional and uncaring.
Maybe because that's what we really were, Harry replied quietly, the words cutting through the formal atmosphere of their meeting like a blade. The accusation hit its mark. King Charles recoiled as if he had been physically struck, his face cycling through emotions that had been suppressed by years of royal training. For a moment, the mask of monarchy slipped, revealing a father who was genuinely hurt by his son's public assessment of their family dynamics.
We may not have been perfect, King Charles said slowly, but we were a family. You've turned us into a public spectacle, characters in your personal drama rather than real people trying to navigate impossible circumstances.
Harry felt a stab of guilt at his father's words. There was truth in the accusation that his memoir had reduced complex family relationships to digestible narrative elements designed to sell books and generate media attention.
But he also knew that staying silent had never been an option for him, not when his mental health and his wife's well-being had been at stake. I never wanted it to come to this, Harry said, his voice softening slightly.
I wanted to work things out privately, but every attempt at communication was shut down or managed by your staff. Writing that book felt like the only way to make people understand why I had to leave.
And look where it's brought us,
King Charles replied, gesturing toward the NDA on his desk. We're sitting here like adversaries instead of family because you chose to make our private pain into public entertainment. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, both apparently lost in their own thoughts about how their relationship had deteriorated to this point. The formal atmosphere of their meeting had given way to something more raw and honest, but also more painful. I can't sign that agreement, Harry said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I won't surrender my right to defend myself or to speak about my own experiences, even if it means we can never repair our relationship. King Charles nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response. Then you've made your choice, he said, his voice returning to its formal tone. You've chosen your public platform over your family relationships. No, Harry replied, standing up from his chair. I've chosen my integrity over conditional acceptance. I've chosen the right to my own story over the comfort of institutional protection. Those are very noble-sounding words, King Charles said, also rising from his chair. I hope they provide comfort when you're completely isolated from the family that raised you and supported you for 38 years. The threat was clear and devastating. By refusing to sign the NDA, Harry was choosing permanent exile from his family and complete severance from the institution that had defined his entire life. But he also knew that signing the agreement would mean surrendering his identity and his voice in exchange for a reconciliation that would always be conditional on his continued silence. I guess we're done here, Harry said, the finality of the moment settling over both men. I guess we are, King Charles replied, his voice carrying a mixture of sadness and resignation. As Harry walked toward the door, he paused and turned back to his father. For what it's worth, I never wanted to hurt you personally. I wanted to explain why I felt I had no choice but to leave this life behind.
I know, King Charles said quietly, and for a moment the formal barriers between them dissolved. But intent doesn't matter when the damage is this severe.
Some wounds can't be healed, Harry. Some trust, once broken, can't be rebuilt. Harry nodded, understanding that this was likely the last real conversation he would ever have with his father.
The man who had once comforted him after his mother's death, who had supported his military career and celebrated his charitable work, was now permanently separated from him by institutional concerns that neither of them could overcome. The walk back through Clarence House felt like a funeral march. The same staff members who had avoided eye contact during his arrival now watched him with something approaching pity, understanding that they were witnessing the final severing of ties between the Duke of Sussex and the royal family. The security officers who had searched him for recording devices were waiting at the exit, their presence serving as a final reminder of how completely his status had changed. They watched him leave with professional detachment, their job completed successfully. They had protected the king from his own son, ensuring that no unauthorized recordings would emerge from this meeting. As Harry's car pulled away from Clarence House, he realized that the search for recording devices had been both the beginning and the end of his relationship with the royal family. It had symbolized the complete breakdown of trust that made reconciliation impossible, and it had demonstrated the lengths to which the monarchy would go to protect itself from perceived threats, even when those threats came from within the family itself. The humiliation of being searched like a criminal had been devastating, but the deeper wound came from understanding that his father had been willing to authorize such treatment. The man who had raised him, who knew better than anyone the pain Harry had endured throughout his life, had chosen institutional protection over paternal love. In the end, The recording device search had revealed something far more damaging than any secret conversation could have been. It had exposed the complete absence of trust that made family reconciliation impossible. Prince Harry had come to Clarence House hoping to rebuild bridges with his father, but he left knowing that those bridges had been permanently burned, destroyed by the very security measures designed to protect them.